Jill.
I figured it out.
The high-tech meeting. How are you
I-
today?
I'm very good. How about yourself?
I'm good, thank you. It's the end of the day for us here in London, so it's always a good time. Starts to
Awesome.
wind down a bit.
Awesome. Yeah, we're just at it's noon for me, so.
Yes, only halfway through.
Right.
I see a few people joining. I'm just conscious of time. Maybe we give everyone a couple more minutes just because it is a little bit early. Uh,
Okay.
and then we'll start off with introductions. I think one of the important things to highlight is that this is meant to be interactive. So anybody who has any questions, feel free to pop it in the comments and we will do our best to answer them. This is an opportunity for us to share our wisdom, our experience, but also for anybody joining to ask any questions directly from Jill or myself as divorce coaches and experts.
Yes, we are experts. We have lots of experience with this.
We've seen a lot of stories, good ones and bad ones.
Right. And I always say I wish I had someone when I was going through my divorce who could guide me
Don't
because
we all?
I made so many mistakes.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here is try and speak to people who are at that junction in their life and share this experience we've got to help avoid those mistakes and hopefully give them a much better divorce experience than the one we had.
Right, exactly. It
So
it needs to be better for sure.
as long as we keep learning from each other, I think then it's the right trajectory.
Yep.
Should we start with introductions? Jill, do you want to introduce yourself and then I'll have a go?
Absolutely. So, I'm Jill Kaufman. I am a licensed therapist. I'm a divorce coach. I'm a trained divorce mediator. I have a certification in parenting. And I wrote a book called I'm Getting Divorced Now What? I have an online course and a group coaching program. I do individual and group coaching. And I did all of this because of my own divorce and how really difficult it was. It was a high conflict divorce. And I hired an attorney who was very expensive. I always like to show like my attorney bills. I keep my attorney bills. It's so funny because like it's amazing what they charge you for, and and this is what I like really want people to know, because like the end of this bill that was like $4,800, nothing was accomplished. What happened was I figured out my own how I was going to get to a settlement with my ex. And so, attorneys have their place and they're important for the law, but like the law is only 10% of what that you really
Yeah.
need in your divorce. So that's why I do what I do. I'm sure your reason is similar, but that's who I am.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Chloe O. I'm based in London. I'm also a divorce coach. I'm a CDC certified divorce coach, and I work in particular with families who are trying to avoid high conflict divorce. So I will work mostly with individuals, and people who come to me are usually just at the start of their divorce process, just trying to decide how they progress from there. And that's really the sweet spot actually for them to contact me, because it's where we can start from the beginning to set the right basis for things to happen as peacefully as possible. And throughout the divorce, there will be conflict. It's impossible to avoid some degree of conflict, but we manage that together. And I work with my clients to help them avoid an escalation that's going to end up costing them ridiculous amounts of money, like Jill just showed, but also dragging out the process and just making it a lot more painful for everyone. So my role is really to try and help my clients to set their emotions aside and manage those to be able to approach their divorce as a business conversation and get it sorted as best they can in the shortest amount of time. And similar to Jill, I mean, my divorce horror story is that I had the experience of having a very amicable divorce originally that then had a second iteration a few years later, which was a lot less amicable. So I have seen both sides of the coin, how it can go really well when the couple is communicating and really on the same page with regards to trying to keep the conflict as low as possible, and how it goes when one of the two, or sometimes both of them, are completely unable to speak to each other and unwilling to compromise. So there's a lot of lessons learned in my own experience, and of course from the hundreds of people I work with, who also have some stories of their own and who have taught me what the typical mistakes might be.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, we're talking about how to start off your divorce, how to kick it off right. And I think there were two things, Jill, that we wanted to mention, right? It was just the importance of being prepared and the importance of sorting out your emotions first. Do you want to touch on that a little bit before we dive in?
Sure. So being prepared, like when I started my divorce, I had no idea how to prepare, like prepare what? What am I
Yeah.
preparing for? There's so many questions. If you haven't been through it, you just don't know. It's very hard to understand like how to start this process. And so, I'd love to talk about that. And handling emotions is one of the biggest things that you can do, because if you're emotional, you can't make big decisions. So we'll go more into that,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, alongside that emotional side, there's also the mindset that people enter divorce into. We have this image on TV and in movies and stuff of divorce being a war, and I think we have to come into the experience as accepting that there are no winners and losers. In a lot of ways, everybody's a loser, but everybody's a winner too, because they have another chapter of their life opening up. But it isn't, your way or my way. At the end of the day, we're all going to have to make compromises, and having that mindset is really important in helping people divorce in a more peaceful way, because they understand that they have to give some things up to get things they really want to get. And that piece is going to be key throughout the divorce. But even at the very beginning, doing that work and getting advice, whether it's from a divorce coach or someone else, really somebody who's going to help frame your mindset from the start, set the right expectations, and get you in the right space before you kick things off.
I love that. I love the idea of mindset because it's something you can control. There's so
Absolutely.
much you can't control in divorce. You can control your mindset.
Exactly, because people always come into my office and say, well, I don't know how my spouse is going to react when I tell them, so I don't know how it's going to go. So are they the only one deciding? Clearly not. We both have a role to play, and having that right preparation is going to be key in helping each person keep control of the divorce in a way that works for them.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
should we dive into? I think we had three particular mistakes that we wanted to focus on.
Yes.
The first one was picking the wrong professional support. Do you want to go first on that topic? It's a vast one. I could go on forever.
Yes, sure. So I touched on it a little bit, but divorce is 80% emotional, 10% legal, 10% financial. That's how I kind of explain it. Because, we really have to get our emotions in check in order to make these decisions. We have to get our emotions in check in order to become organized. So like when we're starting out, most people who I speak to, and myself included, are completely overwhelmed. They're lost. Like I was so concerned about my kids that like I couldn't think, I was like, all their lives you want to protect them and you want to make sure that they're okay, and you're actually doing something that hurts them. And so the amount of guilt that I felt was, I couldn't even describe it. I was like breaking, my heart was breaking. And I think most people feel like that, feel like completely overwhelmed with emotions. And then
Yep.
that state, to be able to like function and like, pick the professional that you need, you or just do anything, it's really difficult. So then what people do is they hire an attorney because they think a divorce attorney is the way to go. And as I said, the legal aspect of it is only 10%. So what you're going to do is you're going to vent to your attorney. I did it. You're going to ask your attorney for advice on they're the kids. You're going to ask about like, what's the best thing for our family? And attorneys, that's not their area of expertise. And so like hiring a divorce attorney as the first step is probably the worst thing you can do. You can have a consultation, like a 1 hour consultation with an attorney just to get some legal questions answered. But even that I would hold off on because, you know, you really want to get all the emotions and other things settled first.
Yeah.
So, and then I don't know if you want to get into, but which divorce attorney you would pick, because
I
you
think there's
don't
both
want,
elements.
yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want a shark, you know, if you want an amicable divorce, you know, so but if your ex is being, you know, very high conflict, you want somebody who understands that
Yeah.
and who has worked with high conflict. So even just that divorce attorney pick is
Right.
important for you to
Right.
understand, like, what professional. But I recommend meeting with a divorce coach because we can help you kind of pick those professionals, which professionals you need and
Yeah.
why you need them and how to go about that. And I also recommend, and I don't know, Chloe, if you do this, but I recommend meeting with a financial professional before you meet
Absolutely.
with, even before you meet with an attorney,
Yeah.
because then you can really get an idea about your
Yeah.
finances. And I have an expertise with parenting. So like if you're thinking about what's best for your children, somebody like me, or you know, anybody who specializes in parenting would be good. It could be a therapist or it could be a parenting coach. You know, like there's lots of people, and lots of divorce coaches have that expertise. So you want to make sure that if you have questions about parenting, that's the professional that
Yeah.
you talk to.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think it really is about building a team. And that can seem overwhelming to people because it seems like, well, first of all, it's going to cost me a lot because I'm going to have a bunch of different professionals. But also it becomes this massive endeavor. But the reality is it is one of the biggest changes you're ever going to make in your life. And you want to make sure you're getting the right support throughout. And so building that team based on your situation, if there's a lot of money there, for sure a financial advisor. If you're going to be selling your house, a divorce certified mortgage broker, you know, all of those professionals, coaches and solicitors, of course, they're called solicitors here in the
Oh,
UK,
right.
but lawyers, you know, it's all part of that team that's going to be around you. So definitely a big piece of the work I do up front with my clients is identifying what type of professionals they need to have on board and when they need to engage with them. And then the second layer, which you mentioned, is not just what type, but how do you select them? And making sure that you're choosing someone who's got the right approach for you. It's not just based on the fees, and it's not just based on recommendations, because if somebody might have had a really good experience with X or Y lawyer, but actually their situation might have been very different. And so understanding who's the best lawyer for you, given your own objectives in the divorce, how you want it to go itself, and then life afterwards, but also in terms of the kind of experience they have, the kind of situations they've handled. You touched upon that, Jill. All of that is going to be really important to take into consideration. And there's a big part of that initial coaching, which is thinking through what kind of questions you want to ask when you're speaking to those different professionals and what is important to you, so that you can make sure that you're selecting someone that's going to work for you, and especially a solicitor, because they have a huge influence on how the process goes down.
Exactly. And I don't know if you want to talk about how a collaborative attorney, and I don't know if it's the same where you are,
Yep.
but people are, you know, say, well, I have a collaborative attorney because I want to be amicable. But collaborative attorneys still, um, you know, the difference between them and a non-collaborative attorney is that they agree that they're not going to represent you if you go to
Yep.
trial. So they have an incentive not to go to trial. But in the meantime, they can still charge for every phone call, every email, and they can push you to things that maybe are not as
Yeah.
important to you. So you really want this other person, like a divorce coach, to help you know what's important to you and know what you want in your divorce. So collaborative attorneys are better, but they're still attorneys, and it still has the issues
Yeah.
that other attorneys have.
Yeah. And you're going to want to see, what kind of mentality that attorney has. Are they part of the amicable divorce network? Or in the UK, we have resolution. It's the same idea. It's networks of professionals who are dedicated to keeping cases out of court. That tells you a lot about their philosophy about divorce and their approach. Somebody who's, as you said, a shark and has that reputation, might be the right person in a specific context, but you have to be aware that they're going to influence your decisions, and they're going to position litigation as probably the best option
Right,
with all the
exactly.
implication that has.
Yeah,
So
not the best option for most
no,
people.
no, definitely not. Absolutely agreed. I think the second error that we were talking about was not preparing enough for your conversation with your spouse. And again, that's another reason why your first call should be a divorce coach, right? Because that's not something an attorney can prepare you for. They don't have the skills, the experience, and their rates don't make sense for that kind of conversation. But having that initial conversation is going to be key, right? You're going to set the basis for the rest of the divorce. And the way you handle that is going to be really important. So I don't know, Jill, if you had any thoughts to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the initial conversation is so important. But I think about my situation, and the initial conversation was great. My ex and I
Okay.
had a great conversation, but then it went downhill. So it's like, it's the initial conversation, but it's also how you're communicating going forward,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So the initial conversation is super important, but how are you going to communicate with them on an ongoing basis? Are you
Yeah.
going to, email or face to face or phone? Like, I have a client who meets every Tuesday morning after they drop their kid off, to have a face to face conversation, and
Yeah.
that's great. But for me, that would have been terrible. Like, you know what I mean? So like, there
Yeah.
are lots of different options. And the other thing about communication is, like, if you email them, you may think what you're emailing sounds amicable.
Mm-hmm.
And I may look at it and I may say, oh, no, 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 you can't send that, because, that's going to trigger somebody.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody says you should do this as a spouse, you may say that to each other all the time. But when you're going through divorce, you want to be careful about saying you
Yeah.
should do something, because you don't want them to feel like you're pressuring them. And so
Absolutely.
you have to completely change the way that you communicate. And definitely attorneys, that's not their area. you know
And I think there's a big element of that initial conversation being kind of the foundation of how you're going to communicate during the divorce. So I think that's why there's so much importance put on it. And it's also, a fairly difficult conversation to have. So people are very nervous about it. They don't know how to do it. And I always advise people to think, about the logistics of it. What's the right time? What's the right place? Are your children going to be around? Is there a chance they'll hear? What do you think that your spouse's reaction is going to be? And then we think about how they say it. And we even do some role playing. What if he or she gets really angry? What if he or she gets really sad? What if they respond in this manner, accusing you, or whatever it might be, to help the person prepare for those possibilities, and have maybe not a script, because that sounds very rigid, but have an idea in their head of how they're going to respond. And I think the guiding principle is to always talk about the future. That conversation is no longer an argument about what's wrong in your couple. You're past that point. You're actually telling them, this is where we stand today, and this is how I want us to move forward. So no point blaming, deciding whose fault it was that everything went pear-shaped. It's really about being constructive at that moment to think about the future. And like you said, Jill, people change, right? So your spouse might react fairly okay when you tell them, and then the next day actually show up, say, you know what, I've decided that I'm going to drag you to court. And so the mood will change a few times, and they're processing. So there's also an element of that.
Yeah, and if you are the one deciding and you're telling your spouse, they are not going to be at the same emotional state as you.
Yeah.
So they may be super emotional, and you may have already grieved part of
Yeah.
this process. So respecting whatever stage that they're at is important. And what you said is so great, because you have to take, um even if they talk about the past, and if they bring up stuff in the marriage, you have to change the conversation so that it's focused on the present and the future. So,
Yeah.
and that's very hard to do when you're
It is hard
emotional.
because you get pulled in, and it's emotional for you too, right? So
Yeah,
it's tempting to revisit what went wrong, but it's not the right moment.
exactly.
That's not that conversation. And I think just like with the conversation when you tell your children, which hopefully you do together, it might need to be a very brief conversation. And people don't always appreciate that, because they, again, have gone through all this process already, and they might have spoken to professionals and thought through how they want to go about divorcing, and thought through some of the arrangements. but actually the other person is probably not ready to have that conversation at that stage. It's really just an announcement, and respecting that they need the time to process it, and that they might not be ready to have the logistical conversation right away. That's also an important part of it. It may be a 5-minute conversation, and then you go your different ways for a few hours, and then speak again whenever. But accepting that is sometimes a bit hard for people because they're ready to go.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily where the other person is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so much to take into consideration when you
Yeah.
do this.
It's an important conversation. It's one of the most important ones you'll have in your
Yep,
life. Um,
exactly.
I saw a lot of people joining while we were talking. For everyone who's joined and anybody who is already on, feel free to pop any questions in the chat. We'll be happy to answer those. We're having a conversation among ourselves, but we'd love to have you guys pitch in and share some of the situations you may have encountered, some of the challenges you have, or any questions you might have for us. Should we move on to the third error, the very
Sure.
big one?
Yeah.
Is that wrong expectations? We were talking about preparation. I think there's a very big piece around taking the time to prepare for your divorce, gathering the right information. The professional selection is part of that, but it's also thinking through which kind of process you want to ideally go through. Are you looking at potentially mediation, or more of a solicitor or a lawyer-based negotiation? Those kind of things are going to be important. Understanding the cost, the time that all of these options take, how the law usually works in your state, just having that information ready so that when you kick off the divorce, you know what to expect.
Right. Yeah. So I think people don't really know about the
They,
divorce process, so their
they
expectations are
wouldn't.
probably not completely correct. But the more you learn, the better, because then you'll know, what you can expect. Because, a lot of people that I speak to think that they have to file for divorce when they are going through divorce.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK, but like here, it depends on the state. Every state has different
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah.
There may be a reason to file, but you don't have to file
Yeah.
in order to start your divorce process
Same
here.
here.
So, you can start, and what I recommend is working with a mediator to start your divorce process, because then you start with an amicable way to get through. If you start with filing,
Yeah.
they have to serve your soon-to-be ex, and that immediately starts a relationship that's not amicable, and
Yeah.
it's not a fun thing to get served, and it's very formal, and then you have a time frame that you have to abide
Yeah.
by. And there are reasons to do that if that's your situation, but if it's amicable, you don't need to do that.
Yeah.
So plus you're wasting time on lawyer fees, or if you're going to ask a lawyer to do that. So that expectation, I think, is there. Like, don't I have to file? I don't understand. Why don't I have to file with the court? I
Yeah.
want a divorce. And so, that's when I tell people, if you have an amicable divorce, you come up with an agreement through the mediation, you can file a signed agreement
Mhm.
as an uncontested
Yeah.
divorce. And that uncontested divorce goes through the court much quicker. You get to decide everything yourself, and the judge usually just stamps it, unless there's some really huge problem with it. But most judges just stamp it, and then you're divorced. So
Yeah.
that's what I recommend, if possible. It's not
Yeah.
always
I
possible to
completely
do
agree.
that, but if possible, that's what I would recommend. But people who are just starting out and don't understand that have completely different
Well,
expectations.
they don't know, right? You don't know what you don't know. And that's where that preparation is important. I mean, I read a book recently that's called Really Good, actually. It's about a girl who divorces in Canada. And they start the process, well, they separate, and they think they're going to get divorced really fast. And then she realizes that in Canada, you have to have been separated for a year to be able to file. And in that year, it all unravels. But the point is, she didn't know what she was entering into, right? And having done that research would have allowed her to know that actually she was going to have to wait a year to do anything about it. They could have negotiated some interim arrangements for the meantime. And there's a lot of things like that come up that people haven't thought through, or just don't know. And having that early advice from a coach is going to be really key in identifying those elements. Another big one that I hear a lot is that in the UK, you can get divorced without a lawyer. People don't know that. So they think that they have to lawyer up, and that's the first thing to do. And that's what they see in movies. That's what sells newspapers, and that's what we see everywhere in the media. But actually, they don't need to do that. If they manage it well, they can get divorced for like 600 pounds. So it's just about knowing, having that information, and understanding the implications of your priorities. If your priority is to divorce really fast, you might make different decisions if it's to divorce on the cheap. It's all a balancing act, but you have to have that early information to be able to make the right decisions. And even in that first conversation with your spouse, you're going to need to have an idea of which direction you're going to be going, or you're hoping to go, to be able to present things in a way that's going to lead you there.
Exactly. And I think that when people hear things from a friend or a family member, they think that, maybe they've been divorced, they think they know everything, and they might go with what they're saying. And, that's dangerous too, because they don't know your situation and they don't know what's going on. So, um, you think that you can get through this with a friend. I mean, I know when I went through it, talking to someone who had gone through it meant a lot to me, because I was like,
Sure.
they've been through it, they know, but they can't advise you on what to do on your situation, because their situation might be totally different. So be careful of getting, advice from people who are not professionals.
Or the internet. That's my
Yes.
big pet peeve.
Oh my gosh, it's so true, because, a lot of lawyers have, like when I Google things, lawyers' websites and blogs
Yeah.
come up, and it's all about, getting them to call an attorney. So like,
There's a
you got
slant
to be
there.
really careful. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, you could be looking. I mean, I have a lot of feed on Instagram related to divorce, of course, and I see stuff coming up, and it says, "Oh, the law has changed in this respect," and actually, I need to go check, because sometimes it's someone in Australia, and yeah, the laws change in Australia, but I was searching in English, and I saw the text in English, and so you assume. So you have to be really careful. Definitely make sure it's the right country. But also, they're going to be talking about a very specific context. And as you said, Jill, other people's experiences are very different. Every case is different. And even based on which judge you get, I think it's the same in the States, but here it really depends on the judge, because it's jurisprudence based.
Right.
And so there's no, enshrined law that says exactly how things are going to happen. And there's a lot of flexibility in how a judge might approach the issues. So no two cases are going to be the same. Your friend might have gone divorced 5 years ago, and the laws have changed, and it really is their case. That being said, I agree that in terms of support and knowing that someone else has gone through it, that's really helpful. And feeling that you're not alone at a time where it feels very lonely, that's really important. But for advice and for setting the right expectations, I definitely recommend speaking to a professional.
That's a great point about talking to people who have been through it, and how, for me, that was like so important in my healing, because I felt so alone. I felt like there was a sign on my forehead, getting divorced, and like everybody was judging me, and like people were, this was such a public thing. So like being around others who were going through it just made me feel so much less judged. And so that is a really good tool for people who are feeling alone as you
Yeah.
go through this, I think.
And what would you say, Jill, is if you had to pick one, like, what would you say is the most common misconception you hear from people about divorce?
I mean, as I said before about, you have to hire a divorce attorney first thing. Um, but the misconception is that people think that you are able to go through this and it's going to be, amicable, like you're going to get through it and it's not a big deal. And what I tell people, this is what I felt like. It's like having the worst day of your life for a year. And that's an exaggeration, obviously, but it's so hard. It's so hard. I
Yeah.
mean, it's one of the hardest things that anybody can go through. They say it's like the only thing that beats it is the death of a spouse. You know,
Yes,
like
exactly. In terms of the
um,
stress, for sure.
yeah, and there are ways to make it harder and there are ways to make it easier for sure. But in general, you know, the amount of things that you're dealing with, all the grief that you're not just dealing with like the loss of the marriage, you're dealing with the loss of in-laws and the loss of time with your children and possibly the loss of your house and the loss of, you know, maybe friends
And the
and
future you had envisioned, right?
the future and status in the community. I mean, there's so many losses that you're dealing with
Yeah.
that, you know, people are like, oh, get over, like someone who hasn't been through it,
Yeah.
and they're like, get over it. You know, it's been 6 months. You should move on.
Yeah.
And it's like, you have no idea if you're still hurting a year later or a year and a half later, that is so normal.
Yeah.
And, you know, you want to be kind to yourself as you're going through this because it is such a huge thing that you're going
Yeah.
through. And I think that's a misconception that like, you know, you can get over this quickly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a very good one. And part of that mindset, you know, from the very beginning is understanding that it's a negotiation, that it's painful, that there's going to be a sense of grief, of loss, of guilt, and just being prepared for that. Even if you're confident about your decision, it still doesn't mean that it's not the right decision. It's just understanding what you're entering into. I'd say actually, I would have picked on another element, which was certainly one of my mistakes, but I've seen it with a lot of my clients, is underestimating the impact that going to court has. But people think they're going to have their big day in court and, you know, some kind of emotional justice is going to be rendered. The judge is going to say, you've been horrible to her, to him, and you should never be able to see your children again. And so they have all these expectations that we see in, you know, in movies and stuff. But actually, first of all, that doesn't happen.
No,
Let's be very clear. A judge
no.
sees, you know, 50 cases a day. They are not vested in your situation. They don't really care from an emotional standpoint. They're there to look at the law. So you're not going to get that big, you know, vindication in court. But also the amount of stress that comes from going to court, preparing for court, facing your ex or your soon-to-be ex in that context. Lawyers say a whole bunch of nasty things about each other's clients. You hear all your dirty baggage, you know, brought out in public. A lot of nasty digs at each other. It's just really, really
Terrible.
difficult. And people don't realize that. They think they're going to have their big moment of glory, and it's the exact opposite. It's
Yeah.
really, really destructive. And so if you can avoid that, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's a bit of a narcissist or, you know, who tends to present very well in public and be very charming, you know, that whole experience is dreadful. So for people to expect, you know, that to be their you know, the moment of justice is completely off and completely unrealistic.
I totally agree. So going to court means that a judge is making the decisions
Yeah.
about your divorce. And you don't want a judge who doesn't have the time or the energy to care about your situation
Who doesn't
making
know
the
you?
decision. Doesn't know you, won't know you, even
And your
after they read
kids.
them.
Yeah.
So you really want to avoid court at all costs,
Yeah.
you know, like if there's some way, and that's what I did because I knew I was going to go to court if I didn't compromise on certain things, you
Yeah.
know, and I ended up compromising a lot on one area in order to get other things that were important to me. And, you know, in the beginning, I felt like it wasn't fair and why, you know, maybe I shouldn't do this. And now, you know, 12 years later, I do not regret
Haha.
not going to court at all. It was the best situation for me, and my kids. I mean, it would have been a war,
Yeah.
and it's terrible.
And
So, I
those,
mean, sometimes you can't avoid it, but if you can, you should avoid it.
And those are the trade-offs that your divorce coach will help you work through as well. You know, what are the things that are your top priority and what are the things that are worth fighting for? And it doesn't mean you roll over and do whatever the other person wants. It just means that you're clear about what's worth your while. And there is, you know, a financial cost, of course, to being more belligerent, but also that stress and that emotional cost, the impact it has on your future relationship with your ex in terms of co-parenting, the impact it has on your kids, on your own mental health. I mean, all of that is really something to really consider carefully in deciding what you're willing to go to court for. It's really got to be worth it.
Absolutely. And sometimes it is. because you have someone
Yes.
who's just not reasonable and you can't agree on something unreasonable. But
Yeah.
most of the times they can, 95% of cases settle out of court.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I think if we were to summarize that, that's kind of the main misconception, right? That idea that divorce has to go to court and has to be warlike, and it really isn't that way. It has to go, and everybody has the power to make things better. There's two people, it takes two to tango, but each individual is half of that relationship, and so has the power to change things. And all the points we mentioned around being prepared, having the right professionals by your side, having the right expectations, all of that's going to come into play in making sure that people can, work through their divorce in the most constructive way. It's not about destroying the past, it's about building your future.
absolutely.
So I think we're pretty much up for time. I haven't seen any questions go through. I don't know if anyone wanted to add anything, ask a question from either of us. Of course, if there's any questions that you want to ask in private, feel free to reach out to Jill or myself, and we'll be more than happy to speak to you. I know that I offer a free discovery call. I don't know if you do the same, Jill.
I do.
Perfect. So you can call either of us for that initial call, free of charge and with no strings attached, and we'll be more than happy to discuss your specific situation and how we can help you, because this is really an important junction in your life, and it's worth taking the time to plan it properly.
Absolutely. Should we say where they can get in touch with us?
Yes, well, they should probably see it on Instagram since they're on our profiles.
Right.
But Jill, what is your handle on Instagram?
At Divorce Coach Jill.
Perfect. And I'm Chloe O, the divorce and separation coach. So you can find either of us on Instagram and of course on our websites and get in touch with us, and we'll be more than happy to help you. I haven't seen any questions go through, so I think we'll close the call. Thank you so much, Jill. This was a really, really good conversation.
Thanks
for your time.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that.
Thank you, everyone who joined. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.